This was a prospective analysis of postmenopausal women participating in the Women's Health Initiative study, aged 50 to 79 at baseline, and followed for a mean of 15 years. Cox proportional hazards models included initial fracture at each location as a time-varying exposure. For every initial fracture location, for example, lower arm or wrist fracture, we examined the risks of fracture at each of the other locations subsequently. For example, after initial lower arm or wrist fracture, we found a significantly increased risk of subsequent clinical fracture at each of the sites we examined, as you can see here. And the patterns were similar for every type of initial fracture. There was a higher risk of subsequent clinical fracture at each of the other sites, as summarized here, with hazard ratios generally ranging between 2 and 6. Hip or pelvis initial fracture was associated with a 27-fold risk of upper leg fracture subsequently. Stratified by age, we see that the risk of each type of subsequent fracture seems to be higher in the 50 to 59-year-olds than in the 70 to 79-year-olds. We see the hazard ratios higher in the younger women than the older for each type of initial fracture, with one exception, initial hip or pelvis fracture, where younger women were not at higher risk compared to older women. The risk of each type of subsequent fracture was increased after each type of initial fracture. Associations were significant in all age groups, even women aged 50 to 59 years. Risks of subsequent fracture were more pronounced among non-Hispanic Black, Hispanic Latina, and Asian Pacific Islander than among non-Hispanic white women. Clinical guidelines should expand their risk assessment algorithms to include this information.